Pluralism, organised by Dr. Nollaig Frost. Thank you for coming, and to have many distinguished people here. I started to make a list, but there were so many, I thought, you know who you are. But especially to Marco, where's Marco for the presentation, which was extremely stimulating. Thank you. Okay, so very pleased that this is being hosted at Middlesex. I've now been here a year, having come from Kingston, before that Roundtable. And I want to thank Nollaig particularly for all her hard work. I mean, she really is a one-woman show doing all this. She has helpers, I know, but really she uses force of character and all sorts of resources to get us underway. So thank you. Yeah. So, yes, when I came here, I brought with me a Centre for Abuse and Trauma Study centre. And what I'm finding is a really good fit with the department here, which has very varied interests, including sort of forensics and clinical health and qualitative methods. So for me, one of the big draws coming here was Nollaig's work. I mean, it was just extraordinary to have such a star in the department who has, I think, helped to found and shape this whole area of discussion around multiple qualitative methods. And very pleased that we'll do extra work together, I'm sure. So really, in my own career, I mean, I'm a bit of an imposter because I do quantitative research, but in my own work, I have really been central to me the issue of context and meaning, because I've measured life histories in people who are often vulnerable, but in the community who are at risk for various psychological disorders. Which includes childhood maltreatment, which includes domestic violence, which includes all sorts of uncomfortable stories, if you like, that I've tasked young, often female researchers to go out and collect. So for me, without the context and meaning, I don't think you can measure these things properly. I think you know, without that, we don't really have a handle. And in order to understand it, we need these life stories as well. The sort of work I've done has been to then try to classify them and categorise them according to quantitative methods to do a quantitative analysis, which then throws me back on what do I do with all those narratives. I've tried done that bit, and Nollaig is going to sort that out for me. So all the individual stories that we listened to and appreciated, but in a way didn't publish, because what we published was the similarities between people rather than the differences. But we have all that recorded, and I think the opportunity for doing secondary analysis and something much more personal and interesting is very good. So I would put a little plea for making links with quantitative. And I was interested, Marco, what you said about, is it squid? When you're being subsumed within and a part of the division that looks at quantitative as well, because I don't think we want to be out on a limb here. I think we need to bring different methods together to try and understand the different things that we're measuring about people. Also delighted that Deborah's here. Where's Deborah? Deborah is one of our very talented PhD students who's probably the most highly trained in terms of different research methods, since we've been training her on some of our CATS methods, and she knows a lot about different quantitative methods. And you know, it's really good that PhD students are getting involved in this kind of discussion as well. So I think I declare this workshop open, and I will join you for the beginning part, and very much look forward to what will be discussed. Thank you. Okay.
Right, right. I was meant to set that up. Okay. Okay, so just to sort of set the scene for us a little bit.
Where it says slide.
Was that all right? Yeah. Okay. So just to set the scene for us a little bit this afternoon, I thought I would just very briefly, because it's not really me that we all want to hear from, it's people that have all of you want to hear from, and also, of course, our roundtable discussants who will be coming up in a minute. But I thought it would be useful just to try and give an overview of sort of how we got to being here today, from my perspective, anyway, why I'm here today, and hopefully why some of you are here today. So with apologies to Loughborough, who absolutely trumped me at a recent conference where we did a whole symposium, they did a whole symposium on pluralism, and I came up with what I thought was a really fantastic slide featuring these pictures. I think they're really good pictures to think of pluralism, but they came up with a much, much better one based on baking and cakes and trifles and layers and separate eggs, and it was just fantastic. But I nearly asked you to send it down so we could show, but then I thought I'd put my faces into off the map. So I know you've seen those before, but for me, I think the reason I wanted to start with is sort of think about what we mean by pluralism is because I know some people have said to me, can I come to your afternoon because I know nothing about pluralism? One person said, I'm not even sure I can pronounce it. So I thought, we've got people there who I know are just interested. I know there are some people here who are thinking about whether it's useful or something they're going to use. And I also know that we've got people here who use it and write about it and explore it and think about it. So we really have got a sort of pluralistic audience in that sense, diverse audience. Maybe I've got to stop overusing that word, pluralism. But for me, I think one simple starting point to thinking about what we mean by pluralism is having an openness to a diversity of views. This was sort of my starting point. And I was very pleased recently to discover that there's something called the Pluralism Project at Harvard University, which defines its sort of basic premises as promoting engagement with diversity, actively seeking understanding across lines of difference, holding personal commitments in relationship with others, and entering into dialogue to promote and foster understanding. Now that project is concerned with pluralism of religion and living within diverse religious communities. But I thought, actually, we could very easily transfer those premises to pluralism in qualitative research. If we think about holding commitments to methods in relationship with others, actively seeking understanding across lines of difference of method, or paradigm, or epistemology, entering into dialogue, so on and so forth. So that was very helpful to me, which then led to me thinking, well, it's all very well saying I've got this openness, but then as a researcher, how do I access that openness? How do I bring it to the research that I do? So, then I'd stop and think about, well, why do I need to? It would just be, I could just like carry on doing what I do. But actually, at the time that I was starting to think about this, there were others, notably Jennifer Mason, 2006, who was saying very, to me, and I hope think in this room, very straightforward facts, straightforward stuff about human experience is not one-dimensional. Human experience is not expressed one-dimensionally. And therefore, she was at that time, calling for qualitatively driven mixed methods research, as Tony has alluded to. And I thought, well, yeah, I agree with that. I don't think it's one-dimensional. And I know that qualitative research brings an openness to issues of context and so forth. But actually, I wonder if we're only bringing one method, we're still putting constraints on how open we are being to seeking diversity, if you follow me. So of course, even earlier, actually, Howard, in talking about it in relation to counselling and psychotherapy practice, said, in order to understand the extent, to gain a greater understanding of the needs of human beings, we need to think multi-ontologically. Needs change, context in which needs arise change, and so forth. So as counsellors, we should be thinking that way too. And so it's gone on through to most recently logic of inquiry, dialectical pluralism, and so forth. But there is academic evidence and academic curiosity out there, and as we know, it's ever growing. But it's also been around for a long time. Pluralism is not a new idea. Using a pluralistic approach is a relatively new idea. And in a way, I think, that's why we have so many questions around it. And it's quite right that we do. We should be questioning using an approach that hasn't been widely used. Why hasn't it been widely used? How are we using it? What are we doing with it? What about these issues and those issues? And that's what I'm hoping will be a sort of theme of this afternoon. We may not, I'm sure we won't be able to answer all the questions. I'd be quite disappointed if we could answer all the questions in 2.5 hours. But we could raise more questions and we can think more about the questions that are already out there, is my hope. But again, very briefly, during my PhD in 2006, these were the questions that were in my head and informed my decision to use a pluralistic narrative analysis. So I was staying within one approach, but using different methods. In order, actually, at that point, quite simplistically, I knew that I was interested in second-time motherhood because I'd just had a second child. So I knew there was a big risk of imposing my story onto my interpretations of other people's stories. So I wanted to try and minimise that, and thought I'd do that. One way to do that was to look at stories differently. And then, following that, we formed the PQR team, many, or half, is it, of which Melissa is here, and Sigdam is here, and Panina is here, which is fantastic. We also have Amanda Holt, and we have Leila Medizade, who are not here. Amanda was due to be here, and she's just got a new job at Roundhampton, and it's induction day, so she had to be there, seeing as it's her new job. But I think it's really lovely, and I want to, say thank you to the PQR team, that we're still in touch with each other, we're still working together as subsets or as a whole team, developing, writing, ideas, research, and so forth. But when we got together, it was to develop my questions, so to look at things like, do different methods bring different meanings? And if they do, how do we then decide on a method, or should we be using more than one method? Do different people find different meanings using the same methods, and so forth? So I won't, you probably all know what we did. We got one data set, people looked at it individually, and we cross-analysed. Melissa interviewed the analysts about their experience. We also analysed the reflexive journals, and we've published that in a range of things. But all in the pursuit of finding a more holistic view. It was a comment from a reviewer, actually, on, I think, our very first paper. And we'd said something like we wanted to capture complete or full understanding of experience. And they said, well, can you ever capture full understanding? Isn't it that you're looking for a more holistic view of people's experience? And that really resonated with us, so it's something that we've referred to a lot. But since those publications, that early work that we did, as many of you know in this room, many of you are doing, there's been all sorts of questions and answers and queries into pluralism. So Adrian raised this term of interpretive pluralism, focusing on readings as both and rather than either or, and putting the emphasis on the role of the researcher, or the queries on the role of the researcher. I'm looking at him now in case he's nodding on what the researcher is doing, and if you've got lots of researchers and so forth. And Adrian related it in particular to issues of where there is not ontological consensus, and first early on used it in anomalous experience, which is something I always quote, which I think is great. We're starting to hear this term now, methodological pluralism, which is what the people at Loughborough have termed looking at the same data set using different methods, which is in fact what we did way back, but we didn't call it that. So it's now got a name, so that's great.
Calling it analytical pluralism.
Oh, you're now calling it analytical? Oh, now you're telling me.
Another helpful reviewer.
Yes, helpful review. Oh, interesting, okay. Melissa and I have used pluralism to argue for evaluation of small micro-context service interventions in view of transferability to larger contexts and so forth. Melissa has also used it to evaluate youth services development and so forth, haven't you? I was delighted recently to be invited to the Houses of Parliament to provide them with training in qualitative methods and in pluralism in qualitative methods, can you imagine? But to realise that they were all policy analysts. So of course it was absolutely, they loved it. This is the real life, this is what it means. And again, going back to Tony's point, they might then bring in a few statistics, but at least they know what they're talking about when they're developing and informing policies. And of course, Brett Smith has also done that in terms of quality of life for people with spinal injuries, I think. And so on and so forth. Not least, being rapidly, and I know because it's still a fairly small field, there's only a few of us using this approach and questioning this approach. So we are the people that they come to for PhD, vivas, and paper reviews. So I know that there are an ever rapidly increasing number of PhDs now using pluralistic approaches. And with that comes a whole range of questions about practical issues, but also through to who examines you, also through to how do I defend my use of more than one method, etc., etc. So that's a whole area. And can I just say congratulations to Nicola Clarke, who got her PhD using pluralistic approach a couple of weeks ago, it transpires, which she kept very quiet when I saw you last week. But congratulations, that's great. And Northampton, we've got people from Northampton who are looking at pluralism in education research, health behaviour we've got, sports and exercise behaviour, and so on. So the field is rapidly growing, the interest is rapidly growing. So with it comes these sorts of questions, and these are sort of what's going to launch us a bit, I'm hoping, this afternoon. Of course, the ever, gosh, I realised I put only one question mark there. That's interesting.
I'm afraid no, mate.
Okay. The questions of epistemology always comes up, rightly. We need to think that through. People will have different stances on it, different understandings of it, different uses and applications of the role of epistemology. Questions of rigour, questions of working across disciplines pluralistically. Very sensible, practical questions about time and resources, particularly, maybe, well, not necessarily only, if you're a PhD student, for all of us, having to find the time and resources to work to the sufficient level of expertise that we need as using more than one method researchers. And that, of course, then raises the question about how should it be taught? Should people be prepared to become pluralistic researchers, or do we stick with our fairly dyed-in-the-wool approaches to teaching, in psychology anyway, to teaching research methods? So these are some of the questions that I'm hoping will come up this afternoon through our roundtable discussion, and then our small groups discussion after that, and then we'll bring everything together at the end. But some of the ways that these questions are discussed and aired, apart from today, are these. This is my first plug of the afternoon for our blog site, our website here, which I'm sure most of you know about, our Twitter feed. We do increasing number of symposia. The next one we know of is going to be at the Qualitative Inquiry. International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry have invited a symposium on pluralism in qualitative research, and that's in America. Several workshops, doing a CPD workshop for BPS. Handbook chapters. Nikki and I got invited yesterday to write a chapter for a new handbook, and the chapter is going to be solely on pluralism and various special issues and things. So there are ways of exploring pluralism beyond just the usual ways of reading articles about it, I suppose. So this is our timetable for today, which is fairly self-explanatory. What have I done?
We were just talking about our 6-minute limit, and so we're hoping that's a mistake there, 2:30 to 2:45.
Right, thank you, Adrian. Well spotted. You get an extra minute. Okay, so 2:30 to 3:45. See, I'm qualitative. So to 3:45. Thank you very much. I'm really strict with you now. Yeah. And at 5 o'clock, I've got wine, which I am going to be drinking, and I would like many of you to join me in. This is today. Tomorrow, think about doing some of this. If you haven't subscribed, join the website. Write us a blog. I know we've got another blog waiting to be uploaded. Write about today, write about your queries, anything that occurs to you. Have a look at the blogs that are there. We've got some really interesting stuff on there. if you've got ideas, please email myself or Deborah, who is now very much part of the PQR network, and it really could not be without her. It actually could not be without her. And certainly the blogs and the Twitter and all that, it wouldn't be without her. Because it's, but Deborah is very much involved, works closely with me on it. And Frauke, I am enticing into it as well. But I didn't dare put your details up because you said, oh, I don't want to be inundated. So email Deborah with any ideas, which hopefully will be generated today about research, about writing, about events, whatever may come into your mind. That is all I'm going to say. Perfect. Perfect. I put some references there because I've made references to a lot of people, but a lot of work. But I know I haven't put them all up because I'm really bad on references and I find them very boring, which is not an excuse to do it. But what I thought we'd do anyway is we will put this up on our website anyway, so that people can see it if there's anything.
What, the slides?
Yeah. And I will also at this point put out my first request, which is if you, a thing I think we should use that website for, amongst many things, is to publicise the work that's out there. So if you've got a paper, or you've published a paper, or you know of a good resource that you've used, let's put it up there, which would be publicising yourself, but also, you know, we can share it with other people who are interested in things. So what I was going to say was that after today, I will finish off doing, and I'll do things like take out. See, this is obviously where I got bored, putting the same thing twice. It's obviously, and we'll put up a full list of references, but please send us your own work. Don't be, I'm all for blowing your own trumpet. I do mine all the time, as you people testify. So send us your stuff and we'll put it up on the website. So we'll have a growing list of resources about conferences, references, papers, books, whatever. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for now, because now I want to get our roundtable people up. And I honestly can't tell you how pleased and excited I am at this group of people that we've got. We've got real representation from across the board of different ways of looking at pluralism, ranging from Melissa, who was on the very original PQR team, through to Deborah, who is doing her PhD using pluralistic approaches, and everything else in between. And I am pretty convinced we're going to hear some really interesting stuff from each of them. So each person is going to talk for their 6 minutes about what they think of, know of, want to say about pluralism. And then I'm going to facilitate with them a discussion, a brief discussion about what's come up, further thoughts that I've had, so forth. And then we're going to throw it open to you. So please do keep a list of questions, and think about what you'd like to ask of individuals or of the panel, as you listen to them. Because I'm the one that hasn't brought a pen, but I can see many people have got pens in their hands. So scribble down your notes to remind you. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll do small groups after that. So, first of all, that might be too embarrassing, so maybe if we've got Professor Coyle, who has just moved to Kingston University, where he's heading up the unit of...
I'm involved with the Centre for Research on Communities, Identities and Difference.
There we are, that's what he does. So Adrian was also a very early attender at our symposia in 2008, and he was really quite difficult there, I think we can say, because he was coming from a discourse analysis perspective and raised some tricky questions for us. Do you remember?
Yes, I do.
And the pity Amanda isn't here because she was our discourse analyst. About, well, what are you doing about context? Subjectivity, you can't mix discourse analysis with other things, and so forth. But since then, we have talked, and we have thought, between us all, we've thought more widely, and in fact you've used it, and with your students as well, you've used it, haven't you? So what Adrian's going to talk to us about, today about, is teaching and providing supervision to people wanting to use pluralistic approaches. Yeah. We've got Jane Murray, Dr. Murray, from Northampton, who I met at a fantastic conference organised by Carmel, who invited me up there for their conference in the School of Education, And there was lots of very interested people in pluralism, people interested in pluralism up there. And I met Jane, who has done work with children, looking at children as researchers, using pluralistic approaches. And I was really interested in it, so I'm delighted that you were able to come. We've got Nikki, who's here, who has recently completed, I'll say it again, her PhD, looking at parenting of elite youth footballers. And your PhD was done using pluralistic approaches. And I don't know how you have convened yourselves, but it's very much part of, or led by, I don't know if I'm stepping on his toes, but there's a fantastic group at Loughborough that Nikki is very much part of, who look in detail at pluralism and have published now at least 2 papers. Is that right? And they also had a day up there that they invited me to go up and speak at and things. And there's a lot of energy up there, isn't there? And you've also got Brett Smith, who's very supportive, I think. So Nikki is going to talk to us about methodological pluralism and sort of overview and some of the issues around that. Yeah. And we have Melissa, who's on the original team. We were working within psychology at the time, but of course Melissa is great because she's got a background that wasn't psychology, and you've got a fantastic title. You did her, what do you call yourself? A social organisational...
Oh yeah, but I don't call
I don't
myself
know. So at the time she did, but now she's morphed into
something else.
Something else. And this very key issue at the moment, and always, of working across disciplines. We're not just talking about psychological insights, we're not talking about psychological understandings to the exclusion of everything else. So how can we make it more useful looking across boundaries or disciplines and divisions in some cases? And Deborah, who is currently doing her PhD looking at attachment in couples, changes in attachment in couples having their second child. So on the one hand, developing some of the work that my original thinking about pluralism came from, but also taking it in a very unique direction, using her own insight, understandings, and training actually that Tony referred to around attachment as it's currently understood and how we can understand it differently using pluralistic approaches. So if you'd all like to come up, I hope I've done you justice there, and sit wherever you like. And then I'm going to hover here. Where you'd be comfortable there, Jane? Yeah? Jane, are you? Wherever you are. One piece of yeah, that works, doesn't it? Okay. Yeah, excellent. Yes. It's very, I don't think we can. Do they? No, really. Oh, Deborah, don't you do it. You go and...
Oh no, I'm just checking the camera.
Yeah, I'm not sure where. We'll sort it out. Okay. What we didn't do was sort out an order. Who wants to go first?
In terms of what we're speaking about, which would make sense to you to go first?
Which would make sense to go first. Right. Well, why don't we start with thinking about the methodological implications of analytical pluralism, and then look at the empirical pluralistic research. Then look at, how should we do it? Look at research of children, interdisciplinarity, and then we'll finish with bringing it all together around how do you teach all this. Yeah, does that work? Okay, so I will do my best to keep you to 6 minutes. Yeah? So if I start waving frantically, don't do what I did once at a conference, start waving back. So we'll hear first from Nikki.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. As Nolas has said, alongside my colleagues from Loughborough University, which 2 of whom are here today, Nick Haddock and Martin Willis, we've been looking at this idea of analytical pluralism, which is the application of more than one qualitative analytic method to the same piece of data within the same study. And we were really interested in understanding, alongside the potential advantages of this approach to produce richer, more complex, more holistic findings, How have researchers started to address the inherent tensions that can arise when we try and use two methods with potentially different theoretical underpinnings from potentially conflicting paradigms? And we were also interested a little bit in looking at the practical application of pluralism. So there's been a few articles that have looked at its potential, but really what are the decisions that we have to make in doing that? How does that affect the interpretations that we can draw? So as part of the meta-study review that we did of papers in social sciences that had used pluralistic analytical techniques, we found some implications for the use of theory, the application of methods, and also the presentation and interpretation of findings. So from a theoretical perspective, it seems that the most divergent findings can be produced when you do use two analytic methods that have these different theoretical underpinnings. So, for example, a phenomenological perspective with a discursive perspective. It sounds like that was the kind of conversations you were having back in 2008. But obviously within that, when you do try and use methods such as that together, that means that as researchers, we need to be really reflective and towards and understand the ontological and the epistemological bases of the different methods that you're using. So as well as them being methods as tools, they do come with assumptions that need to be addressed if we're going to try and join them together in the same study. So our kind of recommendation was that there needs to be ways that we articulate our assumptions in work and look at how we can either distinguish between them, juxtapose them, or creatively combine them to ensure that the pluralistic work that we do remains coherent. Otherwise, there are people perhaps outside of this room that's going to chuck it in the bin marked incommensurability and it's not going to get published. In terms of the practical decisions to consider when using analytical pluralism, things that we've been considering include what type of data are suitable for analytical pluralism, and certainly that being something you need to consider right at the beginning of your work. Which methods can be used together in the same study, and whether analytical pluralism is used by a single researcher on your own or within a group of researchers, and then within that whether or not analysis is applied sequentially or if it's done simultaneously, switching between different lenses. So there's lots of these things to be considered, including how many analysis can be performed on one data set. And certainly a question that we still have that we're wrestling with is whether or not there can be too many ways of understanding a phenomena. So there may be a temptation to go, well, more is better here if we live in this complex world and that people are multidimensional. Can we have too many ways of understanding a phenomena, or do we risk producing findings that are so complicated that we stop being able to say anything of real consequence for practice? And the final point I was going to look at was around the findings, is that certainly I think what pluralistic analysis can offer in addition to more mono-methodological studies is the comparisons that we can draw between the different findings that different analytical methods might provide. So this is where the baking analogy came in. I don't think it quite works without the pictures, but as opposed to eggs in an egg box, where perhaps we present each analysis standalone, side by side, without that discussion of looking at where there are similarities between the interpretations, where there are differences between the interpretations. These are the things that tell us really interesting things about the phenomena under study, and whether or not that meaning is built up sequentially in layers, like a trifle, or whether or not we look across layers.
I've got the slide with me if it helps.
But certainly that look at the comparison between findings should encourage us to engage creatively with the different methods that we have at our disposal.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Nikki. So Deborah, do you want to pick up on that then and talk from the empirical perspective?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of, going back to pluralism, for me, I think it's a great method to explore areas that are not generally explored using qualitative methods whatsoever. So for example, my research is looking at adult attachment, which is typically looked at quantitatively either by using a semi-structured, standardized interview, which has its own coding manual to then quantify into classifications, and you've got all those narratives then that are lost, those really rich data, or by using self-report questionnaires. So for me, I think that looking at attachments qualitatively or any other area that hasn't really been looked at can really start to give different insights into the phenomena of, for example, adult attachments and in couple relationships. So it's a different way of looking at it, and it's a different way of accessing those multiple layers of that experience as well. So you're not just starting off from one point of view necessarily, but you're coming at it with the understanding that there are different levels to that same experience. So in terms of challenges to doing empirical pluralism, as a PhD student, one of the things is definitely the time. So in terms of getting the level of expertise in the various methods that you're interested in using and applying to your research versus being good enough at each method. So how do you resolve those issues and differences for yourself? So there's training involved, there's time involved, there's practice involved, or do you just read it from a textbook and try your best along with appropriate supervision? In terms of epistemological challenges, I was thinking about this in terms of epistemological researcher identity. So with my research, I'm doing a psychosocial, I'm taking a psychosocial approach and then applying a narrative analysis and interpretative phenomenological analysis. So the thing that I'm currently grappling with is, okay, I spend 2 weeks doing the psychosocial analysis, so I'm a psychosocialist at this point in time. How do I then take that cap off and become a constructivist within the space of a few days? So it's about that epistemological researcher identity. Am I keeping those boundaries of that underlying paradigm that I'm coming at the data from? Do they merge inevitably? And how do I switch from 1 week to the next, for example, from narrative to IPA, so then I become an interpretivist? How difficult is that from one moment to the next? And it can feel messy. And a lot of us have been trained to tidy things away, to kind of put it in neat boxes, but the findings are not like that at all, so they have loose ends. And I guess in terms of merging that researcher identity, when you write up the findings from these multiple perspectives, that is an area where these merging multiple identities could be useful when you bring it all together with those layers. Okay, so what I wanted to say as well, in terms of the messiness, is that, as I said, as researchers, a lot of us have been trained to tidy it all up, nice and neat and tidy, but that there are loose ends, and that is a reflection of life. Life is full of loose ends, but loose ends does not mean frayed ends, where we take into account quality, reflexivity, and we are rigorous in the research that we do, as opposed to frayed ends where it might not be done appropriately. So that is a distinction that I want to make between the messiness, but it's a rigorous messiness, if that makes any sense, and the frayed ends of work not done properly. So, I briefly wanted to mention about the tensions, but you kind of covered that, which is fantastic, because I wanted to add to that in terms of this messiness that sometimes as researchers, in terms of the tidying up of things, the different analyses that we might apply might produce findings that are in tension with each other, and it's about being okay with that to some degree. So each layer accesses something different. Each level of analysis is aiming to achieve something different. So it's inevitable that there will be some findings that will be in tension with each other.
Great, thanks very much, Deborah. And talking of messiness, let's hear about children. Couldn't have planned it better.
Well, I'm just going to share a story really with you all about my own doctoral research, which I completed in late 2012. And the project was called the Young Children as Researchers Project. And it really emerged from my previous career, where I spent 20 years as an early childhood teacher. And when I was working with very young children, aged 3 to 8 years, what they found was that every day children were, as children will, getting into all sorts of exciting little explorations. And it occurred to me as I was doing my master's degree that while I was working with those young children, that actually a lot of what they were doing seemed to present very similarly to the kind of work that, that professional adult researchers were doing. And then I moved into the academy to work as a senior lecturer at the University of Northampton. And what I found was that the academy didn't necessarily share my view of young children's potential to be researchers and to present their behaviours in a similar kind of way. And that really was the sort of seed of my doctoral research. So I felt pretty outraged on behalf of all these very young children who I'd spent a lifetime working with, and I thought, right, I'm going to put my Batman cape on, put my pants on outside my trousers, and we're going to really sort this out. And so the project began, and it was going to be jolly nice and neat to begin with. I got a lovely plan for a nice constructivist grounded theory project. It was all going to be jolly super and interpretive. And through connections that I knew, I had some lovely settings who were really keen to be part of it. They were also putting themselves forward. They really wanted to be part of the project. And we had 3 settings in the end. We had children, 138 children and their practitioners. We had 5 children and their mums and dads at home as well, all engaging in the project. But as the time went on, it very quickly became evident that constructivist grounded theory wasn't going to do it. I was going to need some more help. And really by necessity, the project started to sort of grow and develop. I have to put my hands up for this. I have not heard of pluralistic research. I'm really ashamed and I'm very sorry everybody about this. But I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot in the interim. And gradually as the project developed, not only did the methodologies increase, and I started to look at the mosaic approach, which is an early childhood, very common in early childhood research now, which uses multiple methods. But I was also looking at descriptive case study. I wanted to include all of that. And I also wanted to include critical ethnography. Everything, all of those 4 pieces seemed to fit, and in actual fact what I created in the end was a jigsaw methodology, and that was based on the development, also underpinning that, of plural paradigms, because I couldn't develop the methodologies effectively and I couldn't develop the methods effectively unless I was acknowledging the value of different paradigms within all of this. So constructivism was really important, of course, and I was including, for example, critical theory in what I was doing. Not time to go into all of the details right now, but you could read about it elsewhere another time. And the methods were extremely varied and diverse. It was all qualitative, that's the only caveat really, but the children themselves actually presented with many artefacts and many behaviours which were part and parcel of those methods. And because I wanted to keep the door open, because I had this value orientation all the way through the work that we really wanted to promote the children as researchers in the academy's eyes. Because of all of that, everything that they offered in terms of the methods was accepted. And to cut a long story short, on the academy's terms, we did manage in the end to show that what the children were doing was congruent with adult research behaviours. That's it. Did I manage my 6 minutes?
You did. In fact, 5.5.
That's a brilliant memory.
Well done. Thank you very much, Jane. And Melissa, do you want to
So I should probably preface, and Nollaig alluded to this in terms of what I am or how I describe myself. Nollaig's doing this another presentation I gave at the PPS, and I tend to say I'm just a researcher now, just purely because the adjectives got so long that it just wasn't worth saying in the end. But I wanted to reflect a little bit on pluralism and interdisciplinarity, and start really by thinking about the sort of historical moment for me and for Nollaig at least, in terms of when pluralism came out. And Nollaig alluded a little bit to this in her slides. But it was, and it's sort of been touched upon a little bit by the other contributors as well, but if I sort of chart my kind of trajectory in the academy, starting with a master's degree in 2000, I would sort of describe that period as a sort of a period of monomethod and monotheory. And Parisa may or may not want to back me up, but the department we were in had a very favourite theory, and it was that theory or the highway. I personally decided to take the highway, it was much more interesting. And in 2006, when I was finishing off my PhD, I joined Birkbeck on a part-time teaching assistant contract, and was introduced to psychosocial studies, which I think from the beginning was always slightly more interdisciplinary in its orientation than a lot of other areas of psychology. I should also say that my undergraduate degree was in linguistics, and so I always feel like a bit of a phony psychologist anyway. And I was sharing an office with Nollaig, and Nollaig proposed, we started talking about what became the Pluralism and Qualitative Research Project, and I thought, my God, what a fantastic idea. Yes, let's look at the same data from different perspectives or different analytical perspectives, and why hasn't anybody done this before? It makes so much sense. So then I started to think, and in preparation for today, I started to think, well, what actually appeals to me about pluralism? And I think in the end, pluralism, what appeals to me personally about pluralism and interdisciplinarity is also a very personal story in terms of my own sort of biographical narrative. I'm half Greek, half English. I was born in London, brought up in Athens, and have lived in the UK since about 1995. If you really want to piss me off, ask me whether I'm more Greek or more English, okay? And that to me sort of is an anecdotal way of capturing why I really like pluralism, because why could you ever say only something from a narrative perspective, or only from a discursive perspective, or only from any other perspective? Although I appreciate all the questions and tensions that are coming out of that, I have no problem with incommensurability. I'm a sort of living, walking example of that. In terms of, and then in terms of professional background, I think I've embraced interdisciplinarity and pluralism from the outset. I was never really happy in social psychology. I wandered off into anthropology texts, into sociology texts. I'm currently in the social work department, where much like in education, the problems that are thrown up to social work and social work practice and anything relating to social work are very complex. The idea of kind of approaching, and I've just been trying to write a blog post this morning for a different project on child sexual exploitation. The idea of approaching child sexual exploitation from one perspective it just doesn't make sense. There is an organisational story, there is a political story, there is a child story, there's a parent and professional story. So in terms of how so pluralism or pluralistic approaches and methods and interdisciplinarity, I'm sort of using these things interchangeably. But one thing that I sort of have been thinking about is whether pluralism specifically is a characteristic perhaps of psychology, and perhaps qualitative psychology. And I don't, in other disciplines, I'm not sure how much colleagues sort of agonise in similar ways about some of the things that we've been talking about. They do agonise over other things, but just in terms of the kind of the methods and bringing things together. So I don't know if that's something that we can sort of discuss, and whether that's a throwback from the way that psychological methods in psychology have developed and the way that qualitative psychology has developed in particular. How much time?
Not much.
Just very quickly, and the issue of, I'm moving away from the idea of methods and thinking more in terms of sensibilities, but also thinking of that pluralistically, and then a current project I'm doing looking at children's participation cross-nationally and longitudinally, working across sensibilities of time, space, and culture, so another way of using pluralism. And then finally, the crux of the issue on that project is really trying to think of a different way of thinking of this idea of children's participation, which is very much linked to the UNCRC in Article 12, which is all about the voice of the child and being heard. And the pluralistic argument there and the call for holism is much more about thinking, and what we don't do very well is thinking about the civil and political rights of children, and not just this idea of voice and participation.
Fabulous, thanks Melissa. And so, Adrian, how do we get to that from the teaching and supervising research?
Okay, well, I think I volunteered to speak about teaching and disseminating pluralist research at a time just before I was going on holiday, when I might have been sort of distracted or not particularly focused. What I'm going to talk about is really supervising and disseminating pluralist research, because really the teaching of pluralist research can be regarded as relatively easy in terms of the principles. If you've been running a module on qualitative research methods, you will have exposed students to a range of individual approaches, and then at the end you can talk about the principles of a pluralist approach, which has the advantage of adding maybe some coherence to what might otherwise be a relatively fragmented module, as students go, oh, I see, so you can actually use these together for a particular purpose. That's really neat. So the principles I've found, no problem at all. The practicalities, something quite different. In my experience, that's something that has to be worked out or negotiated on a project-by-project basis with individual research teams or individual students. And this gets me into the supervision bit. Okay, so I think I'll start the account of supervision with a major confession. Okay, this is horror story, right? Now, you've heard about using a pluralist approach at PhD level, and the challenges, this has been mentioned, the challenges that might be operational there. Well, after I attended that workshop on qualitative approaches, despite me being a bit obstructive, I came away filled with the religious convert zeal. And I went back to Surrey and thought, I'm going to try this out. But as a proper academic, of course, I wasn't going to try it out myself. I was going to look for a student to try it out for me. So I went and found some unfortunate MSc student who was doing a full-time MSc in research methods and psychology at Surrey, right? I stress this because you'll be aware, full-time MSc, 1 year, and as part of that, just part of that, you have to do a research dissertation. So I sent this per student off to adopt a pluralist approach. And it was all full of reflexivity. Now, I know this is mad. What we got her to do was to go around and interview qualitative researchers, experienced qualitative researchers, about a pluralist approach, what they think about using a pluralist approach. And she then analysed the data using a pluralist approach, using IPA, discourse analysis, and narrative analysis. I have never seen a student look so completely wasted prior to submission of her dissertation. I kind of felt like I should give her one of those silver tinfoil cloaks at the beginning of the marathon runners. Just such a bad idea. So that's the first emphasis, that's the first recommendation. Do not try this with MSc students who have got very, very limited time. Even with PhD students, I've found it, I absolutely echo the reflections that have been offered about how demanding it is. And for that reason, what I've developed over the last few years is a more feasible, more pragmatic way of operating, of implementing a pluralist approach for postgrads, especially those who are working within a tight time frame. Now, many of you will be aware of a paper that was published in 2006 by Victoria Clarke and Virginia Brown on thematic analysis. One of those papers that we all envy. When I last checked, in the 8 years since then, it had been cited 8,800 times, okay? And you'll be aware that they wrote that in response to what they perceived as a fragmentation in qualitative psychology. And their basic line was that there's a lot of papers out there that claim to be doing phenomenological analysis, that claim to be doing grounded theory, that claim to be doing discourse analysis, that claim to be doing narrative analysis, and really they're all versions of thematic analysis. They're all applying a basic set of procedures, looking for commonalities, looking for themes in their data set. And so they distilled from this a set of stages for thematic analysis. And they kept emphasizing, they take great pains to emphasize this in the paper, it's up to the researcher to decide on their epistemology and their theoretical commitments. And I thought to myself, hang on here. It's not a million miles to go from there to adopting a pluralist approach, that kind of flexibility. So what I've been doing, what I've been advocating, and what I've been getting postgrads to implement since then has been a pluralist version of thematic analysis. So they will approach a data set and they will analyze it using a phenomenological version of thematic analysis, a social constructionist version, a narrative version, whatever. They're using the same procedures in each case, but they're looking at it from a different epistemological and theoretical perspective. They're adopting different stances, the term I've been using is different ways of seeing. Now the advantage of this is, I think the advantage has been manyfold. For a start, it doesn't freak students out quite so much when you suggest they're going to have to develop competence in these ways of seeing. When it comes to publishing work, I found that reviewers are much less freaked by that sort of pluralist approach. Because in the past I've had reviewers just go shrieking to the hills when I have tried to present work that is located within a standard methodological pluralist framework. When I've reframed it after it's been rejected and said, oh no, that wasn't what we were doing at all. We were doing different versions of thematic analysis. They've gone, oh, that's fine. Because it's versions of the same thing. It didn't seem to be so mad or so unfamiliar. Likewise, for those who fund research, at the moment I'm using a pluralist approach in funded research. It's funded by a charity that provides bereavement services and they've got us to evaluate their services. And I'm using a pluralist approach. I am not calling it a pluralist approach. We're using thematic analysis, but we're weaving into this different ways of seeing. Okay? So it is increasing our receptivity to pluralist approaches on the part of reviewers, on the part of funders, a greater openness. Now, there may be, you may wonder at the kind of compromise that's going on here. You know, it's sort of sneaky. We're sort of doing it under the radar, not quite calling it a pluralist approach. I think it's a very pragmatic response, a pragmatic implementation of a pluralist stance. But also I have to say there's an added frisson to it. But I'm doing it kind of undercover. I'm a sort of secret agent of Nollaig Frost, who's sort of fulfilling the role of M. You know, I'm James Bond, her M. And so there can be, you can think of it in those sort of ways to give you that sort of extra oomph.
Don't think of it that way.
But it has been, I've found it a very pragmatic way of implementing this with students, for funders, and for reviewers as well.
Very helpful, thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you to all our speakers. So what we thought would be useful, I know I've got a million questions now, which were not the ones I planned, but I've got a few questions that I was going to put to them so we can hear from them. But please do think in terms now of what questions you want answered or discussed. But we'll try and have a bit of a discussion that somehow brings together the key thread of what we've just heard. So we've heard about questions, I mean, in my mind, in a way, what we've heard about is the academic perspectives, the academic view, the view within the academe of this fantastical notion of using more than one method. And we've also heard about the practical and useful implications of using more than one method. And for me, this has been a tension that's been around pluralism as we've worked with it ever since those symposia. In fact, when we planned to hold one symposium after we'd done the research as a team, and do you remember we had such a demand for places that we had to get more funding from QMIT. I think the second lot of funding came from QMIT to hold a second symposium. And what we found was by quirk of advertising, the first advertising had gone out to the academics list. So the first symposium was mainly academics and was what it was. And the second symposium where the academics hadn't fitted into the first one, but otherwise were mainly people from clinical governance, medicine, and people within the NHS. And we had two very different views at each symposium. And I think that's a tension that has come through, not necessarily bad tension, but in the academic world, and arguably, as you say, Melissa, perhaps particularly in psychology, we're looking in depth at some of the methodological, analytical implications of just throwing methods together. And reasons that we are looking in depth at that is because we don't want to be producing research that isn't considered credible, trustworthy, rigorous, high quality, all the words that we would be associating with good quality research that we would look to use in our own furthering of understanding. But the other side of that is, yeah, but we've also got to make it, it's got to be useful. We can sit here discussing it day after day after day. We can, you know, as Adrian's story showed, you know, we can send out poor students doing these interminable projects and everything else. But actually, if it's no use to anyone, then there's no point in it. So the other side of it, which we've also touched on from Melissa as well as from Jane, is actually it's been really useful to be pluralistic in understanding children, in working across different disciplines, in considering our own stances, whether we label ourselves as a researcher, a psychologist, a social worker, a teacher, whatever it might be. So for me, I think that's something that threads through everything that's been said and threads through the consideration of pluralism. So what I'd like to sort of throw to the table first is what do we think there is a role for pluralistic research in applied practice, in informing practice? Does that make sense? So non-research. Is there any point in doing pluralistic research in order to inform practice outside of the academic discipline? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? You please do.
I think just from the very sort of situated context of the project that I was doing, the role of it was it's quite simply usefulness.
Okay.
It was a highly pragmatic approach to get to where I wanted to be.
Okay.
And it enabled those multiple voices to really come to the fore and to actually, in a sense, the irony is that they support the voices, and those authentic voices subordinated the methodological rubric.
Okay. So it was useful to you as a researcher? Is that what you're saying?
I think it was useful to all of those children and practitioners and parents as well.
Okay.
Because it opened the doors to their voices really coming to the fore. So
I see, sorry.
whereas if you stick with one really narrow methodology and you just focus on that, you have to say, I'm not saying there isn't a place for that, there absolutely is. You know, this is a very broad church, but research is a very broad church. But I think that for projects where you do want to reveal multiple ideas, multiple voices and so forth, then pluralistic research just opens everything wide.
Okay. So that makes sense to me, and also puts me in mind of this issue of language, of that if you call something one thing, people will push away, and if you call it something else, they think, oh yeah. So that's also, that touches on that. If we go along and say, oh, I'm a psychologist doing research on your child, people will, but if you say we want to hear different aspects of your child's experience in such and such, people are going to be more open to considering it.
And I think building on Jane's point, for me one of the advantages is that it can help to produce findings for different audiences. So we have interpretations that can be used that show the complexity of participants' experiences that we can share with those participants and feel that their story has been honoured. But also we can look at it from a more critical perspective and look at what things are shaping and constraining or enabling people's experiences that might be more relevant for policymakers. So I think that voice is very important to how it translates into the different audiences that we're targeting. And furthermore, I think this kind of approach helps us to provide evidence, and that you alluded to this, that trying to work with complex social issues requires complex solutions. And in my discipline, which is sport and exercise, there's a lot of people that like using cognitive techniques, and there's lots of people that like using behavioural techniques. And these are the things that we want to go to help athletes and their families with problems. But actually, this kind of work helps us to say there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. There isn't necessarily an off-the-peg intervention technique that can help us solve problems. And it should give us some more evidence so that, you know, complex solutions might actually be the way forward, even though they're a little bit more complicated.
Also in the practice setting, it's useful because often in practice, because it is complex and it is interdisciplinary, and I'm thinking specifically of social work practice or work with children, the tensions that we find in pluralistic qualitative research are mirrored in practice, or we do it vice versa, the tensions in practice. And I think to have that pluralistic framework helps to bring up these tensions and to possibly talk about them in a safe way. And I did this in a previous project, and this community group program for children and young people who'd experienced domestic violence at home. And we'd evaluated that using a qualitative research approach, but what we found is that, and unsurprising perhaps, that the dominant kind of intervention narrative is a radical feminist narrative, but the practitioners who were working and delivering the programme came from social work, they came from childcare, they came from early years, they came from a much more diverse knowledge sources, and often found the radical feminist narrative difficult to come on board with because they hadn't been socialised in that way. And there was a tension there. And so through sort of framing the issue pluralistically, we're able to say, look, your audience, the people who are funding and rolling out the training, is interdisciplinary. So you need to kind of respond and bring them on board to your main narrative. Otherwise, you're going to alienate them. And so that was kind of how we used the pluralistic framework in that particular example. I don't think that's a unique example by any means.
So does that raise a question of, and one of the things that Alan Bryman has said about mixed methods research is that although people almost necessarily have to work together, one from a qualitative perspective and one from a quantitative perspective, they might secretly hold their own sort of bias about which is better or which is going to give the best results or which is going to be the more useful. And that bias may be explicit, as we have had examples of over the years, or implicit, that the way the findings are written up, there's more, more emphasis given to the quantitative findings than to the qualitative, for example. So is that something that would be part of pluralistic research, that we might say, right, we're going to be pluralistic, we're going to work across, we're going to use different methods, but actually secretly my favourite method is narrative analysis, and I'm going to, this is the one that I'm going to pay most attention to, or I'll pay lip service to the other method I'm bringing to it. Do you think that there's a risk of that happening?
I think in some ways that can be necessary. I'm just thinking of the approach that I've been using in recent projects, and we always start with a phenomenological perspective,
Right.
because that's the one that the funders will recognise most readily. And so we begin with that, and that's prioritised, that's foregrounded. And then the role of the other methods is to query that, extend it, or elaborate it in ways that we wouldn't have been able to identify simply by adopting a phenomenological approach. So we decide to apply it in a sequential way, and we build in that prioritization, not so much coming from our own personal preferences, but in a very pragmatic way. What do the funders need? What does the audience need?
So again, does it present a way of saying to funders, this is what you're looking for, here is what you need to see, and we are qualifying it, we can support it through our querying, examination and so forth by our methods?
We tend actually not to tell them what we're doing.
Just present them.
My experience is that the funders that I've worked with are not terribly interested in how we do this. But what it has done in a pragmatic way is to build into the research process for us this tendency to look at the data. It's an invitation to look at the data explicitly from different stances. Now, it may just be that we're not terribly sophisticated researchers, that there are sophisticated researchers that will automatically do this. We found it in terms of structuring the analytic process, we found it really useful to go, right, now we're looking at this from a phenomenological perspective. Now, let's look at this from a social constructionist perspective. Is that giving us something different? So much so that in the present project, the co-researchers I've been working with were so impressed by what was gained by bringing in each new method that they thought, let's bring the funders in now and say, this is what we've got so far. Now, what would you like to from what perspective would you like to look at the data? Are there any particular additional things, quick queries, questions that you have about the data? So we kind of built that in and extended it, but the basic practice was the embodiment of a structured way of viewing from different senses that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Melissa? That is sort of in your...
No, I was thinking about your question quite seriously, and I think for me personally the honest answer would be that yeah, I probably do have a sort of preferred way of working with things that I like, but I try quite consciously to put myself in an uncomfortable position. Because I think, you know, when you work with some of these methods, they might not be your most, they're not really your comfort zone. I think it's an obligation to do that.
As a researcher, yeah, for the quality of the researcher, for the quality of the research, but not necessarily making it explicit to the person funding the research. Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. Are people getting cold? I'm just wondering if we should turn this off again now, because I think people are doing on jackets.
Yes.
Before we get the turns off. That's noise. Okay, so we have one of the buzzwords around for us all as researchers now is around, and I think we're touching on this, is around research impact. You guys can say. And is this something that we can, I mean, we've heard how it can be used perhaps to get funding, how it can be used to produce voices that may not have been accessible before. We've also heard about how it can be of interest to different audiences and for different audiences to ask different questions of something. So is this something that we can also employ to advance our careers, to promote the university or the department within which we work, to highlight a topic to a wider audience in a way that makes impact outside the academy?
But I think it's a way in which we can make research accessible, because it's a way in which we can actually meet people halfway. We can meet participants at least halfway, because what we can do is we can almost weave a dance around the things they're giving us. We weave our knowledge and understanding, our methodological knowledge and understanding around what they're giving us, and that can help us to make sense of what they're saying in the many different ways that Adrian was suggesting. And so the messages that we give will have resonance for more and more people.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, that makes sense to me. So then it raises in my mind the next question is around the issues of dissemination. So we've heard how we can put it to funders, and we've heard how we can, if we can get in front of practitioners, for want of a better word, people who might be using the research findings in their daily practice. What about the more, we've heard from Deborah during the discussion, the more and others, about the more practical aspects of time, resources, decision making. Once we've crossed all those hurdles, what do we then do in order to, what are the challenges and the benefits of disseminating within the academic channels, I suppose, to other academics, to other researchers, I suppose.
Well, one of the difficulties in just normal qualitative research, if you use one method, is that so much is lost when you're writing it for a journal article because of word limitation, word restrictions. So that increases when you're taking a pluralistic approach, because then it's almost like a summary of what each approach and each method has brought. So I find that to be really restricting and haven't don't have a solution yet for that.
Right. But others have you've published, Jane, haven't you?
Yes, I have. I think you've got to really know your methodological onions. You really do. And you've got to persuade other people of that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not for the faint-hearted, and it's certainly not for the lazy researcher, pluralistic researchers, because you've got to be able to, you almost have to be able to analyse the situation before you've even begun. because you've got to work out what's going to fit, and you do it in action as well, not just before and then afterwards. You're analysing while you're looking at the data all the time, because you're thinking in the moment, and then just a few steps ahead to, right now, is this going to really work? Well, can I apply this in this context, or should I really actually now be thinking, well, perhaps I can add something else in there to make a richer mix all the time? You're wanting to be the best you can all the time in pluralism research, I think.
Right.
It's very demanding of a researcher.
I'm wondering how you do that, because I'm just mindful of what Deborah was saying, and I suppose for me one of the challenges is to be able to reassure reviewers that you do actually know what you're talking about when you're saying, well, I use the social constructionist perspective here. Because I have in the past had reviewers' comments on pluralist analysis, and they may be rubbish, I may have an off day when I was doing it. But they brought out the diva in me, because one of the reviewers was saying of our social constructionist analysis, I don't think these people really know about discourse analysis at all. To which I wanted to respond, do you know who I am? But the problem was that we didn't have the space to be able to, and we had to try to make a case, well, you can't really expect us to do a full grain discourse analysis. We were adopting it in a pragmatic way with a clearly defined research question for particular ends here. But they weren't wholly convinced. So that idea of the space constraints, it's also something about having space to prove that you do know your methodological.
Yeah, that's always a challenge, no doubt about it. So we're going to actually write a book that's about that thing.
I was at a conference as Nollaig and Nick and Ross were a few weeks ago, and this topic of journal article space kept coming up. The ethnographers want more space, the ground theorists want more space, and I think we've got this hang-up from quantitative, positive research that might fit more neatly into 30 pages, but at what point do we try and challenge these norms? And I appreciate that there's editorial decisions and that there is space limitations, but there must be some places that are going to be a little bit more sympathetic to a longer journal article where we can do this work justice. And I think our responsibility, everybody here, we have to look at carefully selecting those spaces where we can get this work published. We know some of the qualitative methods, so qualitative research, qualitative methods in psychology are open to this, but let's try and find those spaces within the disciplines as well that might be a little bit more open to receiving this type of work. And know that we here are going to have to take the hits. We're going to get the rejections until people start kind of being more familiar with it and finding those places where we can put in work that represents what we do. And it's going to take, as you say, a lot of time and effort, but really well-written pluralistic pieces that do need that space to prove that we know our audience need to happen, I feel.
So if I could add to that, in Adrian's spirit of and analysis, I think there is also an argument to be made for developing succinctness, possibly as qualitative researchers, and I'm as guilty as the next person. And with that, to take advantage of the huge kind of development of social media and to blog. I think blogs are a fantastic space to disseminate work, not just work in general, but I can see ways in which pluralistic work would be very amenable to blogs. We could do a series of blogs writing from a discursive perspective, writing from a narrative perspective, and have that as a series, as opposed to a journal, just one journal article. So kind of developing different platforms, and I think increasingly blogs are going to have to be taken more seriously in metrics and things like that. So I wouldn't sort of dismiss them at the moment.
And I was also dying to add, because then I went straight over to the audience, but I think also we should also create some spaces. Obviously we have to some extent fit to what sort of people are going to turn to first of all in terms of the traditional journal article, but also I think there's opportunity to think of new ways of disseminating research. What I call videos, but we record something else now. But it doesn't have to be written into a set number of pages and presented out there for someone to pick it up and read it. There must be other ways. I bet if we had a load of children in the room, they'd know other ways of disseminating.
Certainly would.
Oh, yes, exactly. Maybe we should get your, yeah, exactly. And I would also say, on the succinctness thing, that is also something that came up actually at this, what do you call them, Houses of Parliament training, that they said, we have 3 minutes sometimes to read a thing, and if we get a quantitative thing, there'll be 3 bullet points, and we can read it and take it into the, but if we get a qualitative thing, it's like we haven't got time to read it. So we can choose to say, well, tough luck, you're missing out, or we can develop new ways of writing in addition to the details. I think there's a whole array.
Twitter's a very good training method.
Yes, that's true.
Say it in 140 characters.
Yeah, that's probably true. Well, as you know, we've got a writing group this afternoon to look specifically in more detail at ways of writing and disseminating pluralistic research, which Marco is going to take, aren't you, Marco? With Deborah, who is a social media expert. So you can talk more about that later. But now, for the next 10-15 minutes, let's hear from you. What has that provoked? What questions have you got? What do you want to say? What do you think? Yeah, come on.
The message I'm going to take away today is loose ends versus frayed ends. I think that is really brilliant. I think it sums up a lot of what has been said. It's this tension of looking sloppy and not knowing your onions, which could be perceived as a frayed edge. Which can be perceived as a frayed edge, or this idea of loose ends, because if you're contextualising something like childhood abuse, it's so messy, then you can't expect to grab hold of it. And I think that for me has been really valuable.
It was Stephen Frost, it was Stephen Frost who said, we think of stories as having a beginning, a middle and an end, but actually in life, stories have a beginning, a muddle and an end. Which is the same sort of thing, but loose ends that are not phrased is excellent, so yeah. Michael.
This is new to me, so I'm probably going to make this elementary blunder.
No blunders in this room, Michael, just curious.
Yeah. So I'm trying to work out what's going on. I have a sense of a couple of things, and be interested to know what you think. Could there be some kind of positivism kind of lurking under this? In the sense that it seems from everybody there's a sense that the phenomena precede the theory and the research in the world. The phenomena are there, the things themselves, nearly everybody said that, and then we can choose to. But surely, don't the theories kind of, whether they're psychoanalytic theories or discourse theories or whatever, Marxist theory, don't they sort of create the phenomena,
But that's a different paradigm. Yeah, if we were taking a psychoanalytic or discursive or a critical perspective, then the context would come first. If we were taking it from a phenomenological perspective, experience would come first.
I'm not saying you can't do it, but by doing it, isn't there this assumption that actually the thing itself is completely independent of what we... I mean, when I do research, I've got this fond idea that I'm contributing to some theory, which, maybe I misunderstood.
There's a model that you start off as a project with an idea about there being a phenomenon, and then you get into it, and then you get to this model that actually the phenomenon is something else, and there's much different on there, and that's part of the model, isn't it? And in some way you are constructing that phenomenon, or discovering it, or it's from your childhood trauma, or that's just part of the journey, without it necessarily being simply a positivistic kind of idea that the phenomenon's always there.
Yeah, sort of.
Have you got them?
And there's, to come back to the term that was attributed to me at the original workshop, there's a both-and aspect about this too. I'm just thinking of, incidentally, that notion of using thematic analysis in a pluralist way. I have it in elaborated form. It's being published in an article next month. If anyone would like a pre-publication version, just contact me. But in there, we report on a pluralist analysis that we did of interviews that we conducted with smokers and ex-smokers about the impact of research on the health implications of smoking on their behaviour. Okay, So we conducted, the participants were aged 70 or over, so that they could reflect upon a lifetime. And there was, we identified in the interviews a dilemmatic position. People were talking in those terms. And as we thought about that, we thought, well, hang on here. Has this project, has this study placed them in that? Have we constructed a dilemmatic position? You've got people here who are smokers or ex-smokers who are having to talk about, knowing about the health implications of smoking through this research many years ago, but they still continue smoking. Now that's a difficult thing, it's a socially problematic thing to discuss and to talk about. And so did the actual project itself place them in this dilemmatic position? And that's what took us into a discourse analytic look at the data in relation to this. But in the end, of course, we had no way of choosing between whether what they were talking about was a dilemmatic situation that existed outside the research context, or whether it was something that was generated entirely by the research context. And so in the end, we had to say, well, we can't actually choose, but it may be, there may be both here. We went for that both and approach. So it was one of those occasions when I think there's definitely something in what you're saying. Again, this may just be the way that I apply pluralist research, because it was the first time that I was very aware that our way of doing the research may actually have fabricated the phenomenon that we ended up looking at. And I'm sure that may be there to a greater extent than I might have appreciated in the past. So I do think there is something to be thought about in the question that you raise.
Can I just say as well, I suppose a lot of the work I've done in the past has grasped the nettle of who can be a researcher and what does it mean to be a researcher, and is it only a privileged few who have the right to actually theorise and to have those theories recognised and accepted by the academy and therefore inform policy, or sometimes it's the other way around, isn't it? But I think within all of that what pluralist research offers is an opportunity to really open that very widely. I think, as I'm repeating myself a little bit now, but that in a sense democratises this thing that we call research. Because there aren't just a few people who can do it.
There's not many people that can do pluralistic research.
But I think it's this notion of, I've got in my head this phrase, which I might have got from your paper, the constitutive force of theory. Did I get that from your paper?
It's a quote from another paper.
Yeah.
Is it a quote from another paper? Yeah. But it, as I understand it, that's about theory constructing a thing. So for the sake of this argument, we could talk about, it's because the theories exist that we see the phenomena. So perhaps what we're saying here is that by bringing different ways of looking at this theme that has been theorised into being, we can, as Adrian said, what did you say? You query, you do it phenomenologically, and then you question, query, and explore or something, the thing. So in that sense, I think it's a democratization as well, because it's bringing different ways of looking at something that's been created, saying, what is this thing, and how do we understand it? And in the questioning of the thing, from different perspectives, we can either dismantle bits of it, reinforce other bits of it, reconstruct it, etc., etc. And also, I think that democratizing is about how you then present and what you present to who, the different audiences. Things will be either people asking different questions, or people with different interests. I just want to be a better teacher, or I want to understand the radical feminist understanding of children's learning. Would that be fair?
And the irony is, I suppose, is that we create a new paradigm by doing this.
Yeah, that's my
Every time it's applied in a new way, we could argue, this is a new paradigm. That's messy.
Yeah.
We were interested in a distinction between different types of pluralism from epistemological pluralism, which is I think what you've suggested, where your ontological assumptions might start more phenomenologically. So you have those, you know, that the world is made up of experiences, but that you appreciate that you can use different ways to look at those experiences, versus an ontological pluralism, where something like dialectic pluralism is literally trying to bring different paradigms along side by side and to consider that the world is made up differently and how you try and hold those together. So I think there is that distinction as well that might help with that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point and kind of gets to my reaction to that. Because I think the problem you raised seems a problem to me as well when you're talking about that ontological pluralism. And I think part of this is that we end up talking about pluralism in the singular.
Yeah.
But the things that you've all been talking about describing are very different ways of putting things together. So it seems to me if you're doing discourse analysis and phenomenology, they can't share an ontology. Maybe you find some way to construct some new kind of ontology, but you can't just kind of merge them together without losing fundamentals of the world is like this, no, the world is like that. But if you're doing interpretive phenomenology and descriptive phenomenology and phenomenologically informed narrative, you've got that common ontology, but you can have very different epistemologies. So I think there's a problem with talking about pluralism as if pluralism is one thing. There's a pluralism of pluralism.
Yeah. It's very pluralistic.
I think that because this is capturing people, I think for good reasons, and I'm one of those many people who discovers belatedly I've been doing this for decades and didn't know I was doing it. There's a danger of what you're saying, that it becomes a thing. There is a thing called pluralism, but actually it's not a thing. It's going back to Nolas' first point. It's a way of thinking differently.
Yes, it's a set of
and there's a number of
principles,
ways of thinking differently, but they're all about saying let's rub things up.
Yeah.
You can be rubbing up at ontological levels. That's different from epistemological levels, or from data collection method levels, which might share epistemology and ontology, what we do with your visual images and your text. So, that's just me.
I think that's really helpful, and that's one of my bugbears, because what will not be helpful, I think, would be, you have this way of doing things, that way of doing things, or the pluralistic way of doing things, and it becomes a thing. And the closest, I don't know how many people know about the pluralistic, what's called pluralistic counselling, the Mick Cooper and John McLeod. And they've sort of tackled this a little bit, whilst at the same time coming up with a fairly structured view of counselling, I think, pluralistically. But they talk about holding, and this isn't in terms of counselling, but I think it's just as relevant here, is holding onto what they've termed the agony of diversity. And so by doing that, it maintains an openness to responding to the needs of the clients they talk about. But I think if you sort of put the research focus or the research question or the research topic or whatever at the centre, responding to the needs of that is a way that maintains or potentially maintains the creativity of bringing the many different ways of exploring it.
And I think that the term holding, the psychoanalytic meaning of the word, is actually really useful in terms of not trying to reduce things to a particular paradigm or ontology, and trying to hold those tensions together, because they exist in life, and why not exist in the analyses of it as well.
Any final comment? I saw the tin coffee going, so my attention is now going. Is there any final thing that people are burning to say at the moment?
I wondered if anyone was a bit cross with us, actually, because I think, you sort of touched on it, but you're far too polite to go any further at the moment.
That was me trying to be all kind of...
Because I could see that if people looked at it from a very, if a really staunchly positivistic person might look at this, they might find it almost insulting, really.
I don't know whether people would be insulted. I think people would be insulted would be purists within qualitative traditions, and they'd be most insulted by the thing which is almost the same but not quite. So you find your work as a phenomenologist with another person, but if I'm a descriptive phenomenologist and you're my peer person,
I just had this yesterday in a meeting when we're running at Kingston qualitative research summer school next year, next July. We joined the program yesterday, and at the end we thought we have to have mixed methods. And I said, well, why don't we get Nollaig along to talk about pluralism as well? And another member of the group said, what's pluralism? And one of my colleagues said, it's something practiced by researchers who have no commitments or principles.
Give me that person's name. I'll deal with that.
The purist, absolutely, I've had experience of this.
And it is a very interesting note to finish this part of the afternoon on, because they're, of course, what the mixed methods people are fighting very actively at the moment. People like John Cresswell and people like that are fighting back against the anything goes accusations that they've been throwing at mixing methods. Oh, well, you just do this and you do that for no good reason, and so we're not sure what you come out with. So he and others are fighting back successfully by coming up with a set of designs by which you do mixed methods research, which has been snapped up by the International Institute of Health Behavioural Research or something. And so there, now we have mixed methods nicely boxed, going back to boxes that were produced this morning. So it is, there's another tension, you know, we get those accusations, and do you respond by boxing things nicely? Or do you say, yep, that's us, you know, sorry, well, you know. So. Final thought, and then we're going to have a quick little tea.
It's a very tiny one, because I'm just at the very start of my PhD, and I suppose I'm just playing around with all the different methods that could be using, and I'm really interested in the pluralistic approach. I suppose the thing that I'm sort of holding on to, you know, whatever you end up plumping for, it's about your methods need to reflect what it is you're trying to find out.
Yeah.
And that's the simple, like, you know, the simple answer I've got I'm holding in my head. And
I
be open to everything, really.
Yeah.
I think that's a good note to end on. I think that's so yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all our discussants. I hope you agree that was really informative and really helpful. And I think thank you to all of you as well for a great discussion. Go and have some tea and coffee and biscuits, I do believe, push the boat out. And then we'll come back in here at 4 o'clock with an idea. Oh, we're only doing 2 groups. So whether you want to be in the writing and disseminating group or the developing research.